We are moving through the series based on Barbara Brown Taylor's book, Learning to Walk in the Dark. In our first week, Dr. Carla encouraged us to take a broader view of the dark and darkness, maybe even considering a different perspective from which to tell our stories of the dark. Uncouple our either-or thinking about dark equals bad, evil, and light equals good and right. Last week, Reverend Wayne asked us to consider reframing our hearts, to consider redeeming darkness as God redeems us, to know that wisdom and hope and love can come in the darkness. I encourage you to re-listen to their messages of thoughtful encouragement. As we think about humanity's relationship with darkness and light over time, the Industrial Revolution and continued technological advancements have helped to cover the world with more and more light. And that light pushes back the darkness that some find so daunting and fear-inducing. As I was growing up, I was taught as a child that nighttime prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. What a burden to lay on a child, and a beginning of possible instillment of night terrors and fear of what can happen in the dark, and fear of the dark itself. It's little wonder that we equate darkness to evil and find ourselves doing all that we can to illuminate that darkness at all costs. Taylor writes that the brightest spots on earth have never been the places where the most people live, as we've heard, but rather the places where the most prosperous people live, where there is money and power enough to light up the night. Darkness doesn't even stand a chance. That's why it's so important for those of us with the resources to look with full face towards our fear of the night. I, of course, after having read that, had to find out where was the brightest spot on Earth. And National Geographic tells me that from space, Las Vegas, Nevada is the most brightly lit spot on Earth. And Pyongyang, North Korea is the most dimly lit city on Earth. While I don't want to paint money and power in the well-lit skies with the same broad negative brush that darkness receives, I did want to point out that it is so very often the misuse of money and power in the light and in the dark that needs to be repainted with the brush of justice and equity, compassion, and grace. We can give what we can to carry out God's desires for peace on earth, peace and love and hope, no matter what our means. So what has it cost humanity to drive back the dark, and why should I care about the cost of illuminating the night? Taylor goes on to suggest that one reason to care is because our inner and our outer worlds are so closely related. Having those periods of darkness turns out to be as important to our physical well-being as does having periods of light. Our bodies need darkness to make our immune systems work. Our bodies make melatonin when it's dark, and it can only be made in complete darkness. Otherwise, if there's light, that system turns off and creates something else. We need it to sleep well, and we need darkness to fight diseases like cancer. Our body's rhythms influence the regulation of our wakefulness and our sleepfulness as a response to the light and the dark in our environments. And it's similar to the natural cycle of day and night in rhythm. So driving back the darkness is having an impact on our physical health. Taylor encourages us to consider developing a nighttime or lunar spirituality. One of my favorite spiritualists that you've heard me speak of in the past is Saint Teresa of Avila, a 16th century Carmelite nun of Spain. Saint Teresa had a companion in ministry who was a priest, Saint John of the Cross. and he had an interesting perspective on the dark and our spiritual health. St. John of the Cross says that the dark night is God's best gift to us, intended for our liberation. A liberation about freeing us from our ideas about God, our fears about God, our attachments to all the promises of believing in God, our devotion to spiritual practices that are supposed to make us feel closer to God, our dedication of doing, believing all the right things about God that we're supposed to believe, our positive and negative evaluation of ourselves as believers, even our tactics for manipulating God, and our surefire cures for never doubting God again that never seem to work. All of these are substitutes for God. They get in God's way. Now that's something to think about and feel about in relation to the dark from St. John of the Cross. Might we be getting in God's way and God's work in us by avoiding dark places? So what exactly is this idea of lunar spirituality? I joke that I enjoy nature from the inside out, and that's actually true. I would rather watch nature from inside my house, looking out my window. I joke about that, and it's true. At night, I can see the moon and the stars and the night creatures from inside my house. Even better, I can see them when I turn off the lights. I get the chance to enjoy the wonders and the beauty of darkness in the darkness in a way that I could not experience it in the light. And last night, I don't know if you were looking outside, there was a beautiful half-lit, quarter-lit moon, and the phases of the moon and the cycles of the moons that waxes and wanes that we'll hear more about in the coming weeks, that lunar spirituality. We absolutely can experience God in nature. Nature presents us with God's awesome handiwork and lets us experience the attributes of God reflected in that handiwork. Grandeur and splendor, beauty, humor, loud thunder, quietness. All of these attributes of God we can see reflected in nature. Taylor suggests that if we have lived life with its myriad of experiences, we can consider that endarkenment, the act of making something darker, can be as vital to the soul as enlightenment. This might be a spiritual gift that most of us would prefer to leave on the table, or to leave in the closet, or not to even invite into our lives at all. During my years fresh out of college, I also found myself, I was looking for myself and reaffirming who I was and who I felt God was calling me to be. I would often sit in my apartment in the dark to remove distractions and the attention grabbers that were so plentiful around me. I also had to learn to be with my thoughts in the dark, to be in communion and in spirit, and to listen, to experience God in those dark places. It helped me to focus. I also had to learn to speak out when my roommate came home so I wouldn't scare her to death. It was in those times I learned to really listen to God in my heart. And eventually that time in the dark became focusing and comforting for me. And my roommate eventually came to expect to find me meditating in the dark and learned not to be startled. As a young naval officer on my first duty station, I had other experiences of the darkness as well. While we were at sea, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, I had to exit the comfort of the nighttime red lights throughout the ship and step outside above decks to get to my post for my evening watch. I found myself standing outside no matter what the weather and waiting until my eyes could fully adjust to the dark. And each and every time they did, I could then experience what was out on the ship and out in the sea. The fluorescent flying fish that moved above the water right next to the ship. that other boats and ships that were out on the sea, the stars, and most importantly, my eyes adjusted to the night time so that I could see the hazards that were in my way as I walked. I think this might be a part of my deep and abiding affinity for the sea. The sounds, the salt spray, and perhaps a bit of the danger as I walked. Walking the 25 yards, sticking close to the side of the ship as not to venture too close to the railing, which was a potentially deadly venture. As sailors, we were well trained enough to know that falling overboard at night rarely resulted in one being recovered by the ship. The longer I stayed and stood in the dark, the better my eyes adjusted to being able to see dangerous conditions that existed there if I wasn't careful enough to see them. My relationship with the darkness deepened on my own patience to let my eyes adjust so that I could safely navigate above decks. Our scripture today in Psalm 139 is the ultimate encouragement of God's presence wherever we find ourselves. There is nowhere I can go or be that God isn't there with me. In the light, in the twilight, in the dark, God is there. God is an enveloping presence. And some try to run and hide in the darkness, hide from God, hide from ourselves, hide from each other, for whatever reason. Have you had a time in your life or circumstance when you've tried to run or hide from your God? Know this, God is there, whether you can see or feel or experience the presence of God or not. God is there, right there with you. Taylor suggests there is an over-focus on what she calls solar spirituality, which by her estimation means a biased focus on the sun and light of spirituality. The happiness and joy of answered prayers and being right with the world. We'll have reliable and trustworthy answers to all of our prayers. And alternatively, it becomes problematic and in keeping with our training and upbringing that when struggles and hardships happen, when God seems far away, when we're hurting, we've learned to label these as dark times to get through as quickly as possible. Do we tend to associate God's presence only with the light and what we consider to be the absence of God's presence with the dark? Is it possible to find beauty in the darkness and uncouple that darkness from what we've been taught? We're each encouraged to consider just maybe, possibly, perhaps, approaching the edges of the thought that what it might mean to develop a lunar spirituality. A spirituality of darkness with God, who travels with us in the dark and in the light. What does it mean to have our spiritual eyes adjust to spiritual darkness? Perhaps spiritual darkness is an invitation in those places to slow down for a moment and let our spirits catch up with and take in what God's offered to us. Having our spirits become accustomed to and aware of those spiritual things around us. Perhaps in those dark moments or those seasons, our spiritual vision can become sharper, more acute, and more ready to take in that spiritual experience. What if we're being called to other spiritual places of growth, rebirth, or renewal in the spiritually dark places, so that we can emerge to other places, dark or light, with a different perspective and relationship with the God of our understanding, and a deeper impact for growth? In your spiritual practice this week, try your hand at updating what we've learned and maybe what you now know about this rhyme, this prayer. Maybe this is the first time you heard it, but try retooling it just a little bit. Maybe something like, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Keep me safe this night, I pray. Watch over me, Lord, both night and day. Amen.